previous 3 videos on Punjabi lore, I really enjoyed exploring the history of Punjab before Sikhism. I learned about my own ethnic background and then how the Punjabi culture started to evolve. So I thought next it would be interesting to delve into something a bit closer to home, the end of the British Empire in Punjab and the early South Asian immigrants to the West. I also feel it would be really interesting for our generation who now live in UK, US, Canada, Australia, etc. to understand our parents' and grandparents' generation, the struggle they went through to create the life for us now in the West. So, to understand this, I want to follow the story of Mr Singh. We learned about the history of Punjab in the 15th century in the previous video, so we have to go back to the future, and by future I mean 1930. So to get an understanding of what Punjab was like at that time, by 1930 it had been 80 years since the British Empire annexed Punjab, the last province in India to be annexed. It had been about 80 years after the Second Anglo-Sikh War in 1849. Many Punjabi soldiers had already been deployed and fought in World War I by the British, and in 1921 the British took the keys from the Golden Temple treasury at Amritsar. Sikhs were arrested in large numbers for kirbans that were too long or for wearing black turbans. This created a lot of agitation between the British government and the Sikhs, and this caused the Akali Dal to be formed, a semi-military organisation for passive resistance. An anti-British sentiment grew larger than ever. It was also around this time that the RSS formed, an Indian right-wing group that spread the ideology of Hindutva, a Hinduism national identity. It later drew inspiration from European right-wing groups during World War II and was even banned once during British rule. And so it was at this interesting point in history, in 1930, that Mr Singh was born in the village of Mullapur, Dhaka in Punjab. Boys went to school, but girls mostly stayed at home, did the housework, tended to the cows and milked the buffaloes. Any time a white British woman was driven by the village, the children would chase after the car, saying Mem Sahib. This title is normally given to a woman of high authority in India. Young Mr Singh was interested in maths, and he dreamed every night seeing equations and always dreamt of becoming a maths teacher. As the young Mr Singh grew older, World War II broke out, and once again many of Punjab's men were sent to foreign lands to fight in the war and sacrifice themselves as they had centuries before. By the time the war was over in 1945, Mr Singh was already 15 and engaged to be married to a young girl in the village of Duguri. In this newly formed village, the family were tailor masters, making textiles and clothing, where Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs lived together in harmony, as we saw in the previous video series. Meanwhile, in Punjab, the political tensions were growing, and the British Empire had already expended a lot of its resources after the war, and so a plan was drawn up to partition the subcontinent, which happened to cut through the Punjab. On August 1947, Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy General of India, announced the creation of West Pakistan, East Pakistan and India. What ensued next was a horrifying reality for the people. Villages were ripped apart, violence everywhere. Some girls were locked away for fear of their own safety. Some women even committed suicide, and fathers even killed their own daughters to protect their family honour. 15 million Muslim, Hindus and Sikhs were uprooted and forced to leave their ancestral homelands and move to their allocated territory, the largest human migration in recorded history. Around 2 million were killed during the partition. British soldiers were confined to their barracks. They had been ordered by Mountbatten to save British lives only. There were trains of only corpses going to and fro the new countries. These were bodies of people who were killed or died on their way to their new homes. Fortunately, Mr Singh and his family were saved. Luckily, their side of the divided Punjab fell within India's territory. However, his Muslim friends and neighbours were not so fortunate. The most significant factor for migration was that a member was seen as an individual investment for the family. So the primary objective for migrating was not to permanently settle overseas, but to add to one's joint family of resources, sending regular income back to India. This brings great family honour or izzat to the young migrant, and this cultural notion also greatly influences the migrant's perception and behaviour while he's abroad. This means the interests of the family take precedence over the interests of the individual. This obligation allowed men to leave their family, their wife and children to the security and shelter of their homes back in India. Post-World War II and the Partition, Britain's labour shortage was the perfect opportunity for the early migrants of Punjab. The British Nationality Act in 1948 created a new status, citizen of United Kingdom and its colonies, for people born in UK or one of its colonies. This fueled mainly men from Asia to send money back home to their families. Then, the Commonwealth Immigrants Act in 1962 introduced tightening restrictions, requiring immigrants to have government-controlled employee vouchers. This caused a spark of new arrivals in the 1960s, as many of the men sent for their wives and children to join them in the UK. Young men such as Mr Singh decided to travel abroad after hearing the wonders of the Western world, with the ability to earn and send his money home like so many young men his age. There were actually only an estimated 600 people living in Scotland in 1950 from the Indian subcontinent, but this would soon change in the decade that followed. Mr Singh managed to finally get sponsorship to the UK, and so the journey from his ancestral homeland of Punjab to the UK began. Mr Singh, now in his 20s, had to leave his wife and 2 young children with his family in Punjab. In those days, the wives were brought at such a young age to their husbands' extended family homes and made to cook for all. And so, after saying his last goodbyes, Mr Singh took the long journey from Punjab to Bombay and entered a large ship. On this ship were young families, mothers and children. The passengers formed a community, washing, cooking, cleaning, spending time together for weeks on the ship. They had plenty of time to imagine what their life would be like and what experiences lay ahead in the foreign land of Great Britain.